Now, I don't know if you've heard, but there is a war going on. Not in Iran, but in your comments section, actually, and your timeline. Oh, and the group chat where somebody just posted a Jordan Peterson clip and everyone just lost their minds, because a Jordan Peterson clip is a politeness extinction event on all sides. I'm talking about the war between men and women, which is, as we know, the most exhausting war in history. No bombs, but infinite sequels. Between people who think that modern men are victims and people who think that that is the most offensive sentence I've ever written. And here's what I want to say right at the start before you decide or try and gauge which side I'm on. I think both sides are getting played hard, which is, you know, always a comforting thought. Nothing brings people together more than discovering you're both being absolutely railed, right? Not by each other, by something else that's making an absolute ton of money from the fact that you are furious. We are all furious at the wrong people. And I can prove it with science and receipts, which is how you know I'm serious, because nobody says receipts unless they're about to ruin the mood. But fortunately, the mood is pretty bad anyway, so let's go. So I'm going to start this video with a few statistics, and these are facts without judgment, just the numbers. Now, there's a reason I'm bringing these facts at the start, so stick with me, because I'm going to loop back to them at the end. Male suicide runs at roughly 3 times the female rate, 17.4 deaths per 100,000, compared to 5.7 per 100,000 for women. And that is the Office of National Statistics, not a Manosphere website, manosphere.com. No, it's the ONS. More men under 50 die from suicide in the UK than any other single cause. In 2024, 44,000 fewer young men than women accepted a university place. The Higher Education Policy Institute calculated that over the past decade, accounting for birth rates, 500,000 men are excluded and missing from higher education who statistically should be there. And the share of young men that are not in education, employment or training rose from 13 to 17% between 2019 and 2024. And I'm reading you those numbers to show that something has gone genuinely, seriously wrong. And the neuroscience here has a story to tell as well. Naomi Eisenberger at UCLA ran studies showing that social exclusion and economic insecurity activate the same neural pathways as physical pain.
How does the brain process rejection? And so we brought people into the fMRI scanner and we set up this game that Kip Williams has used before called Cyberball. And essentially what happens here is people play this online virtual ball tossing game with what they think are 2 other individuals. And what happens is they're playing the ball together, and that at a certain point in time, the 2 players who are actually controlled by a computer stop throwing the ball to the subject. The subject essentially is socially excluded. And so here we could look at what's going on in the brain during that moment when individuals are feeling socially excluded, when they're experiencing social exclusion. And when we were running this study, we got back the data, and I was actually analyzing it. I was sitting next to a fellow graduate student who was analyzing a study on physical pain. And this was a study like in irritable bowel syndrome patients. So these were serious chronic pain patients. We were sitting next to each other. We each had our data up on our computer screens. And at some point we noticed just how similar our data looked. I was looking at a study on social rejection. She was looking at a study on, chronic pain, manipulated pain experience. And at some point it got hard to tell which study you were looking at.
Wow.
And so based off that, we thought, it sort of looks like social rejection is activating some of these same neural regions that are implicated in physical pain processing. And in some ways it makes sense when you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, given how important social connection is for human survival and for, more broadly speaking, mammalian survival. It's possible that the system that makes sure that we stay socially connected may have actually piggybacked right on top of the physical pain system. So kind of borrowing that pain signal, not only to alert us when our bodies are in danger of being harmed, but when our social relationships are in danger of being harmed as well.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? Literally the same regions of the brain light up. Which means that when someone says, man up, neurologically, It's about as helpful as telling somebody with a broken leg to jog on, mate, just walk it off. So to put it another way, when somebody loses their job, loses status, loses their sense of purpose, that's not just weakness and fragility in their life. That is, neurologically speaking, the same as being physically hurt. And that fact, again, doesn't add or take away from any side of the argument to say that the manosphere is responding to something real. The pain is real and the crisis is there. But the explanation that the manosphere comes to is where it gets really, really interesting. So in 1979, a psychologist called, actually, this is French, so I'm going to let somebody else say it.
Henri Tajfel.
I can only apologise. I'm very English when it comes to pronunciation. I can offend literally everyone, including myself. So Henri
Tajfel
published research about understanding how group identity turns to prejudice. And what he found is that human beings are tribal by nature. And that's not as a flaw, but as a survival mechanism. Because for most of human history, being accepted meant safety and being cast out meant death, literally, not figuratively. So the brain evolved to be exquisitely sensitive to group membership. Who is us and who is them? Are you part of my group of or are you part of that group of and is this group of under threat? But here's the uncomfortable part. Henri ran experiments showing that you do not need history, ideology, or any genuine conflict to trigger the tribal response, right? He divided people into groups based on something completely arbitrary.
Is a study by Henri Tajfel, in the 1960s, that did a very simple study, sort of experimental design with his students. He called it the minimal group paradigm. It doesn't really matter what the difference is, and it doesn't really matter how small it is. It can still result in this favouring of your in-group over an out-group, whatever separates you. So what he did was have his class of students, and I do this every year with my students when we teach this stuff. You get your class of students, you've got 20 kids in the class, and you tell them, right, I want you all to estimate how many beans are in this jar. You've got this jar of beans, and they're looking, okay. And they all guess. Then you tell the students that some of you overestimated the number of beans and some of you underestimated. Now I'm going to split you by your under and overestimations, and there are two groups. You're the underestimators, you're the overestimators. Now, in reality, I made this up, right? I didn't actually count the number of beans in the jar. I didn't actually see who were the over and underestimators. I just split the room in half randomly. But they thought that they were split based on that actual distinction, right? So they already started to form a group identity. Well, we're the overestimators and we're the underestimators, right? And a very minimal difference. This isn't based on race. This isn't based on gender. This isn't based on shoe size even. This is based on something completely pointless and meaningless, guessing how many beans are in a jar. Then you, in that experiment, ask them to distribute resources to each other. So you give them a piece of paper and you ask, there's a finite amount of money and you have to distribute resources to each individual in the group. But they all know what individual belongs to what group when you're asking them to do this. And 9 times out of 10, every time we've done this, when you tot up the allocation of resources, they always, 9 times out of 10 at least, allocate more resources to their in-group than their out-group. And that was one of the very first studies to prove that it doesn't matter what kind of difference there is between groups, you're always going to favor your in-group over your out-group. Now, favoritism of your in-group is not necessarily a terrible thing, okay? It's a pro-social thing in many regards. The out-group end up suffering because they have less resources, but you're not actually attacking the out-group in any way. You're not actually, waging a war with them. So it takes a lot for this in-group preference to turn into anything sort of nefarious in regards to the outgroup. But under the right set of conditions, and I call these accelerants in the book, under the right set of conditions, if things fall into line, all of a sudden this in-group preference turns into this sort of out-group derogation. And that's where we start to see the formation of prejudice, name-calling, ridiculing, the use of slurs to describe the out-group.
Just because the brain, once it assigns you to a group, starts protecting that group automatically, like dogs. We are like dogs, which explains why people defend their side online with the intensity of someone guarding a medieval castle.
I fart in your general direction.
Because when identity is threatened, the brain, it doesn't reach for complexity, it reaches for an enemy. Now, imagine you're a young man in 2024. You're economically very unstable. There's a cost of living crisis. You feel culturally invisible. Nobody in mainstream politics talks to you, right? Nobody seems to have a language for what you're experiencing. So imagine you're part of that group of growing, excluded young men in our society in 2024, and you go online. What happens next is not an accident. Researchers at NYU Center for Social Media and Politics found that algorithmic recommendation was the single biggest driver of radicalization, more significant than the content itself. Was the single biggest driver of radicalization, more significant than the content itself. To repeat that, the algorithm was more significant than the content itself, because the container shapes the contents, and the container works like this. You search, why am I struggling? You get served a video about male disposability. You watch it, the algorithm serves you something slightly more extreme. You watch it, the algorithm serves you something slightly more extreme. You watch that too. And each step retains you another 30 seconds. Each step makes you a little bit angrier, a little bit more certain, and a little bit more focused on a specific enemy. And that's not a conspiracy. That's optimization, an unconscious A/B test running on your pain at scale in real time. And at the end of that pipeline, there's Andrew Tate in his Bugatti, or someone like him waiting with open arms, just telling you that they understand you. And here's where I don't want you to look away, because this is the part nobody's talking about, okay? Don't look away. Andrew Tate built something called the Hustlers University, which was later renamed The Real World. And the pitch is this. It's pretty simple.
Welcome to the smartest decision you've ever made, Hustlers University. This is the smartest thing you've ever done. If you're sitting there wondering, you should already know, but if you're sitting there wondering, is this going to be worth it or not? Buckle the fuck up. This is the smartest thing you've ever done, because this is the first time, besides the PhD course, where I'm going to lay down all of my knowledge in the world about a particular subject. PhD course was girls. This is going to be about business. Everything I know about making money. So the way this came around was I was convincing yet another person to not go to university. I have convinced, well, I don't know if I've actually convinced them, but I often say the biggest mistake people make in their lives is traditional education. It's a waste of time, it's a scam.
And you know, it's always inspiring when somebody becomes a multimillionaire by teaching other people how to become millionaires. It's just one of those happy success stories. You pay $50 a month and he'll teach you how to be a man and how to win in a world that's rigged against you. And at its peak, it had 200,000 members. You can do that maths yourself, right? I'll wait. Yeah. That's the GDP of a small island nation funding a man who thinks that moisturizer is a feminist conspiracy. And don't get me wrong, it absolutely is. Give me a fiver. And social media, when all this was happening, was taking its cut from every single hour of Tate content watched on platforms. Billions of impressions. The platforms and the grifter in perfect symbiosis. One provided the vulnerable audience and one provided the rage. But both took a cut. And here is the thing that is key. What happened next? The backlash content. The Andrew Tate is awful. The takedowns, the drama channels, the reaction videos, the hot takes, the feminist response videos, the counter hot takes, the hundreds of thousands of videos generating hundreds of millions of views, and all of those views serving the identical engagement signals for that same algorithm. All of it monetized, all of it profitable. And fun fact, it's the only war in human history where both sides are sponsored by HelloFresh. Now, on this point in 2017, a neuroscientist called Molly Crocket, which is a brilliantly Dickensian name, published research in Human Nature Behavior. which is one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet, showing that social media platforms systematically amplify moral outrage beyond what people would naturally express.
So first, let's take a look at how digital media might affect the kinds of stimuli that trigger outrage. Now, moral outrage, as we know, arises in response to perceived violations of social norms. In everyday life, in Western democratic countries like this one, directly witnessing or experiencing such violations is thankfully pretty rare. So this is a figure from a recent study by Hoffman and colleagues. In this study, they signaled people randomly several times a day on their smartphones and asked them to report whether within the last hour they had committed, been the target of, witnessed, or learned about a moral or immoral act. What they found is that directly witnessing or experiencing immoral acts accounts for less than 5% of people's reported daily experiences. And these were US participants, a fairly diverse sample. In fact, most of the immoral acts that people encounter, as you can see here, are learned about. So this black bar is the highest. So where exactly are people learning about immoral acts in their daily lives? Well, they asked that too. Actually, you can see that people are learning about immoral acts more in online settings than in person, and then via other forms of media. So the first thing we can see is that digital media really increases our exposure to stimuli that could potentially trigger moral outrage. But there's more. And to see this clearly, it's helpful to compare what moral outrage might be used for in our ancestral history versus now. So before the internet existed, gossip really functioned to spread news about who you could trust and couldn't trust within your social networks. And so people are sharing information that's going to be valuable within their own communities, that's going to facilitate trust and cooperations within their communities. But now, in the age of Facebook and Twitter, where information sharing platforms are generating revenue through advertising, the incentives controlling the spread of information have profoundly changed. Newsfeed algorithms select for user engagement, and they promote information that is most likely to be reshared, irrespective of its ability to promote trust and cooperation amongst those who share it. So what is it that makes online content go viral? Well, in a landmark study on this topic, Jonah Berger and Katie Milkman looked at New York Times articles, the most shared list. And what they find is that the extent to which an article triggers anger is the strongest predictor of whether a headline makes it to the most shared list. So the data are pretty clear, and that finding has been confirmed in a number of other studies by Milkman, Berger, and other people. Anger promotes virality, and virality is profitable. Because strongly emotional clickbait headlines generate more revenue through viral sharing, it's possible there could be a natural selection-like force that could generate what's called a supernormal stimulus. So, is there any evidence that the incentives that are present in social media environments are creating supernormal stimuli? Well, the very design of social media platforms encourages the habitization of responses. Offline, the stimuli that trigger outrage and the response that we choose is typically unique to the situation. But social media apps streamline these stimuli, responses, and outcomes into a heavily designed architecture.
Social media platforms systematically amplify moral outrage beyond what people would naturally express, because outrage drives engagement. The platform doesn't have a gender, it doesn't have values. It has an agenda, which is profit. But what it does have is 17 different ways to A/B test whether your suffering is more profitable in landscape or portrait. Turns out, portrait. It doesn't care who's angry or why. It just needs the anger. The anger is the product. So what we have is this, right? A generation of economically precarious men in general neurological pain handed a ready-made enemy by an algorithm optimized for their outrage. And then a generation of people, many of them women, many of them with completely legitimate grievances, handed a ready-made enemy in return. And both sides fighting, and both sides certain they're the ones who are right. And the whole time, the platform is making a metric ton of money from it. The platform is just completely neutral, just standing in between the two warring parties with a card reader. Because the gender war keeps both sides on the platform and neither side looking at the profit motive. Because attacking the profit motive isn't, surprisingly, profitable. Attacking each other is. And the men making money from real male pain have got no financial interest in ending the male pain. Just like the people doing podcasts about success have got no interest, vested interest, in actually making people more successful.
If you want to be successful, don't then add it into your successful idea. Don't then try and contend with two different ideas and give 50% to each.
Their goal is just to make themselves more money. You can see that here. Everyone in this ecosystem has a financial incentive for the war to continue indefinitely. Well, everyone except you. Now here's the moment where I want to introduce psychologists and economists Anne Case and Angus Deaton.
I'm Angus Deaton.
And I'm Anne Case, and thank you for being with us tonight.
They're Nobel Prize winners from Princeton, and their research found that deaths of despair are rising in parallel for both men and women. The crisis isn't gendered.
The same is true for suicide in every state, and the same is true for accidental and intent undetermined drug overdoses. If we could go to the next slide, you'll see it's also happening not just for men, but this is happening for men and women both, but only for those without a college degree. So in our early work on this topic that the media would write up, they would write properly about it in the article, but oftentimes the headline would read, "White men dying." And indeed, the men are dying, but it's more white men and women are dying.
You can see from this graph that the women do these things less. I mean, there are fewer deaths, less death rate from drugs, alcohol, and suicide among women than men. But the point is the increase has been basically in parallel, maybe a little more for men than women. And for people, and the divide between people with a BA and without a BA holds for both groups. So this is happening for men and women with less than a BA.
I want to start just by saying that in this book, we talk about the fact that American capitalism isn't working for Americans without a four-year college degree. And that's about 2/3 of all Americans between the ages of 25 and 64. And in the book, what we do is we document what that means in terms of despair and in terms of lives coming apart. And then we dig in and we talk about why we think it's happening, what the failures are, and what we might be able to do about it. We're not against capitalism. We believe in capitalism. We think, though, that it needs to be put back on the rails to be working for all of us.
Driven by the same forces, wage stagnation, deindustrialization, the collapse of community, the slow withdrawal of any kind of economic security, the gender war has two sides, the class war has one. And the people profiting from turning the class war into a gender war are, almost without exception, not in it. And here's the thing to make us all pause, is that people who run the platforms are not ignorant of that research, because they have entire departments of behavioural scientists, people who understand human cognition at a really high level. And they've pointed all of that intelligence at making sure that we don't swipe away from ads about HelloFresh or whatever VPN they're pushing today. That's why I use Clockwork Orange VPN. Because when I don't want my eyelids to close against the absolute horror and outrage being poured at me by the algorithm, Clockwork Orange VPN keeps me absolutely glued to the poison. That's Clockwork Orange VPN, to keep your eyes glued to the poison no matter what time zone or country you're in. Because they have simply decided that fixing it is far less profitable than not fixing it. And they're right. And that's not an accident. That's not an oversight. That is a business decision made by people with access to all the evidence, and in full knowledge that the consequences fall almost entirely on the people that are not them. The Manosphere did not build the pipeline. They just sell things inside it. The pipeline was built, maintained, and deliberately optimized by people that will never be touched by what it produces. And that's worth sitting with, right? It's pretty bleak, but there is a way of combating it. There is. And it's this. In the 1970s, Daniel Kahneman, another Nobel Prize winner, identified two modes of thinking that operate in the human brain. And he put it roughly like this.
System one is essentially what comes up automatically in your memory. So, when I say 2 + 2, something comes into your head. When I say your mother, an emotion comes. So all these things that are automatic, that's what I call system one. And you have no control of it because it's automatic and involuntary. System two, the slower thinking, is distinguished really not so much by the fact it's slow, although it's pretty slow, but by the fact that it's effortful and deliberate. So what you can do deliberately, you do in system two. And you can, control yourself, control your thoughts, perform complicated computations. Those things are activities of system two. So system one does most of the mental work. It happens automatically. We don't have to worry where to put our next foot or what word should come next. Some of the work, and it's important work, is done by system two when we slow down.
Do decision makers sometimes think they're in system two when they're actually in system one?
I think mostly. I think most of us feel that we have reasons for what we're doing. But in fact, we do what we're doing very largely because of reasons that we're not necessarily completely aware of. And then when we're asked, why do you do this? We have reasons. But the reasons are not necessarily the causes of our actions.
System one is fast, emotional, automatic, tribal. It's the part of you that when it sees an Andrew Tate clip or a Jordan Peterson clip, it feels immediate rage or immediate recognition. It's the part that reads a comment and wants to fight. And it's the part that the algorithm specifically, precisely, and scientifically optimized to keep you inside the system. Because system one is where the money is. Whereas system two, that's slow. It's analytical, it's effortful, and it has a terrible retention rate and generates almost no shareable content. It doesn't trend, it doesn't go viral, no one's clipping it for TikTok. Its click-through rate makes paint drying look like breaking news. And that second part is the part that asks, who benefits from this framing? What are the structural forces underneath the algorithm? Why am I being shown this right now by this platform at this moment? Essentially, system one is the part of the brain that writes the comment. System two is the part, reads it later and goes, oh, I'm probably going to have to close this account and actually maybe move to a new postal district. The Manosphere and everything it generates is system one product. Built for system one, designed for system one, and the content telling you how awful the Manosphere is, also largely a system one product, because that's what travels, that's what gets shared. That's what the algorithm rewards. The moment you shift to system two, the moment you start asking who owns the arena, who profits from the fight, whose economic interests are served by you being furious at the person on the other side of the gender divide, rather than the system that put you both there, well then you become slightly less useful to the machine. The machine. It does feel like a machine, doesn't it? But that's not because you've necessarily left the platform, but it's just because you're harder to manipulate. The Manosphere told a generation of suffering men that their enemy was women or feminism or modernity, and also generated a lot of content that told a generation of women that their enemy was men or masculinity or the Manosphere. And the whole time, the actual story, which is the wage stagnation, the deindustrialization, the hollowing out of working class identity, the platform business model that monetizes human suffering at scale, at industrial scale, that story has always been right there in plain sight. And this is why I'm making this video, because it's heartbreaking to have the same conversation with my male friends and my female friends over and over again. Don't hate men. Don't hate women. Hate the algorithm that's motivated purely by a profit model. It's a very sophisticated piece of software that has accidentally discovered that human suffering is extremely engaging content. And it would like to thank you for your continued participation. And that's why I ask you to go to Clockwork Orange VPN and to type in Barry's Economics, ouch, for 20% off never being able to turn off the algorithm, whichever country you're in. Clockwork Orange VPN. Become the matchsticks. I don't know where I'm going with this. Right. Just cite the code Barry's Economics to Clockwork Orange VPN for your free breakdown.